Hey guys, I'm back, and this time I'm reviewing another film. This is a new one called A Little More Flesh. It's written and directed by Sam Ashurst. He previously directed Frankenstein's Creature. Sam is a film writer and commentator, and he also co-hosts the Arrow Video podcast. Watching this film was a really interesting experience for me. I'm not really used to seeing films within films, which is what this is, but I really appreciated what was done here. So A Little More Flesh unfolds as a director records an audio commentary for his first feature, which was a banned sort of like 70s sexploitation entitled God's Lonely Woman. So we're to understand that the director, Stanley Durrell, is inside this like small studio space, and he's just audio recording and like sharing his experience being on the set and his opinion of his cast. Yeah, like strange observations as we move through the film. And not only is he sort of like a pretentious guy with some maybe slightly pompous attitudes towards the cinema and towards his own status as a filmmaker, but we also start to realize that he really has some kind of like condescending attitudes about women, and that he sort of doesn't really hold them with an equal regard to men. How he perceives the women is so slanted on how they look. So that's predominantly how he's judging them. His perception is very much predicated on their sexual desirability, and he often makes quite critical comments about them. His female leads are Isabella and Candace, and these two ladies clearly were chosen for the way they looked, and he obviously judged them to be beautiful enough to be in his movie, but he still maintains a level of kind of like resentment towards them, and he sometimes says that they could have been, more elegant or more attractive, etc. So that was an interesting like ambivalence that I picked up right away. What's also important to bear in mind as we watch the movie is that we discover that his two female leads, we discovered that they actually passed away. One died during the production, and the other one just 2 days after the premiere. And he often insists, the director Stanley Durrell, he often insists that their deaths, both by suicide, had absolutely nothing to do with the film. But as we hear the way that he comments about them, and just his extremely sexist and misogynistic views about them, make us realize that, maybe his treatment of them did contribute to how they were feeling at the time that they died. So he's not adverse to, treating them however way he wants to get the scene that he has in his mind. So he just wants to manifest his vision, and he is quite ready to exploit his actors to get what he wants from them. At one point, he even drugs Isabella. I think he gives her LSD without her realizing that she's consuming it, and then she's tripping out, and we get this extended scene of her dancing, and he's talking about her body and the way it moves in the commentary. And as the film progresses, we just it becomes more and more clear that he's kind of like a creepy guy who has inflicted a lot of discomfort and a lot of grief, particularly on his female colleagues, and something is lurking, something within this film, some ghostly phenomenon is just waiting to like emerge and take its revenge on him. But he doesn't quite realize that until the very last scene. So the names of the characters are important also to remember. I'm going to just focus on the two women because I think they're the ones that provide the most meaning in the discourse of the film. So Isabella is supposed to represent God's lonely woman, and Candace is temptation. Just even by those signifiers, we're invited to associate kind of a scenario in which the female subject on her own is like an incomplete entity. You know, she's lonely. She's in search of something. She's kind of wandering and trying to bring some meaning into her life because she's incomplete on her own. And temptation is inserted into the film not so much as something that necessarily evolves the female character in her own right or for her own sake, but I think temptation here is more some sort of prop or facilitator for the enjoyment of the male viewer, particularly as we're invited to judge Stanley Durall, this fictional director, as someone who is deriving erotic pleasure by looking at his female subjects. So temptation really is just an accessory for the male gaze to derive some kind of enjoyment from God's lonely woman. That's how I read it. At one point, in the commentary, Stanley Durall says that that his filmmaking influenced Stanley Kubrick. And because, this fictional film, God's Lonely Woman, is meant to have been produced in 1978. So that's 2 years before The Shining. And there's a very specific scene where the camera angle is kind of like pointed upwards at a male actor as he's like opening a door. So we're watching him from the floor kind of perspective, if you follow me. And that is a shot that is an exact replica of what we see in The Shining, where Stanley Kubrick's camera work is very much like gazing up at the male figure of Jack Torrance, played by Jack Nicholson, at the Overlook Hotel in The Shining. So it's an exact copy of that. So we're sort of invited here to make an association with The Shining, and specifically that shot in The Shining by Stanley Kubrick, and we're being told that in fact this was all an influence of Stanley Durall, which really amused me. But also the name Durall is interesting because it sounds a bit like Duvall, like Shelley Duvall, and I don't know whether Sam Ashurst did this consciously or whether it was like a strategic move in the story to make an association with Shelley Duvall, but of course, we've heard stories that there were moments during the shoot of The Shining where Stanley Kubrick may have lost his temper, or maybe he was impatient with her or very demanding, and that she reacted in a way where she seemed distressed by their interactions. And so in a way that's kind of like there as some point of reference for this film, where we have like a male director who's very powerful, where he's treating his female actors with disdain or some kind of like way that is unequal to the men. A Little More Flesh is a very interesting watch in other ways as well. You kind of, after a while, like after you forget that you're watching a movie within a movie and it's a director reflecting back on his choices and on the experience of the shoot and his opinions about his cast, etc., etc. After a while, it just feels like you've entered the internal monologue of a director and you're kind of just there with him, like a fly on the wall inside his head, and you're just like bearing witness to his thoughts. And a lot of them are very like disturbing. And you find yourself taking umbrage with a lot of the things that he's saying, but there's nothing you can do to stop it. This is his monologue. This is his interior voice. And all you can do is just kind of like hear it out. He clearly has some toxic views about women. It also kind of like serves as an interesting cultural piece, discourse about how sometimes men talk about women, just in the wider discourse. And it's so tinged with like voyeurism, and I wouldn't say just men, the way that men necessarily reflect and articulate their views about women. I don't know whether this was a conscious decision by Sam Ashurst, but a lot of it, the way that he talked, sounded like headlines you see in the Daily Mail like website, like the Mail Online website, with like the infamous sidebar of shame, with like headlines about women's bodies and pitting women against each other, and like these kind of like seedy sort of like observations and commentary, like this running commentary about what women look like, and kind of always denigrating women. It's like a meat market. It sounded a bit like that. Like it's as if his internal monologue is completely predicated on the same kind of like value system as whoever is running the Mail Online website. But it's also important to add that website, it has the largest online traffic, apparently, of like newspaper websites around the world. So it generates a huge amount of ad revenue because there's people from all over the world clicking on this page to get the latest gossip, like celebrity gossip. So, I mean, it's pretty vacuous, but yet it generates a lot of public interest, and people are kind of peering in like voyeuristically, looking at persons of interest. It's usually like celebrities sometimes flashing body parts, or they're just getting out of a car or something, and the caption of the photo says like, so-and-so is flaunting their flesh. It's kind of like really twisted. This belief that people out there just living their lives, not paying any attention to who's looking at them, that somehow they're looking for attention, using their body as a prop. So that's the perception. Of course, it's completely inaccurate. So here's a little theory I had about this movie, A Little More Flesh. My belief is that this director, Stanley Durall, like he comes across as really narcissistic. He seems to think very highly of himself. And he just has a lot of like bravado, but he doesn't necessarily deliver. Actually, his superiority complex is really something that is masking an inferiority complex. And maybe he's also envious of his two female leads. Like they've got star quality, or, sheer just raw talent that he doesn't possess. And he feels compelled to talk about them in this denigrating way, because that's his strategy to kind of lower them in the hierarchy in his own mind, where he can then claim that he's superior to them. The method that he uses, his tactic to lower them in relation to himself, is to voyeuristically like approach them in a very consuming and a very predatory kind of like sleazy way. I heard it once said that the method of surveillance works because the object that is being surveilled was originally deemed a threat. So the object of surveillance was originally judged to be some form of danger. So the surveillance is to kind of zero in on some aspect of the object and over-endow it with meaning. And then the voyeurism becomes like a strategy where the person looking adamantly through the process of voyeurism gains some kind of power over the perceived threat of the object that is being surveilled. And the method to cope with that perceived danger is to over-endow it with meaning, to fetishize it. And that's exactly what's going on in A Little More Flesh. The director, I think, has envy or some kind of jealousy in relation to his female leads. So the way that he's coping with it, his tactic, is to literally fetishize them, talk about them like they're objects, survey them, with the excuse that he's making a film, but his camera actually just becomes a device, like a phallic device to look. It becomes this kind of eroticized prop through which he glances at them, but in a very specific way. He's looking at them, over-endowing their body parts and over-endowing their physical attributes with meaning. So they can just become reduced from their original status of danger or threat, reduced down to just an object that's being gazed upon, just an object that's being used and abused. And therefore, through that process of voyeurism, the object can relinquish its meaning, and cease to be this kind of castrating agency. And this is when the film becomes a kind of like revenge tale, because rising from the dead, from the afterlife, Isabella and Candace return to the set, return to the mind of the director, return to the process of shooting this film, God's Lonely Woman. They actually haunt the scene, which was supposed to be the final scene, which was supposed to be a rape scene. They haunt that moment, and Isabella cuts through the penis of the director. Like, she literally takes out his penis, stabs it, and like slices it in half. It's a very gory scene, and whoever was in charge of the special effects did a really good job. It seemed really true to life. But this moment of castration is, I'm coming at it from a psychoanalytic perspective. It's not insignificant. It's a reversal of the process of voyeurism. The object that had been surveilled, whose body and whose subjectivity had been objectified and over-endowed with meaning, is now turning the tables and attacking the phallic extension of her perpetrator. His anatomy was the driving force of his discourse. Everything was revolving around like some sleazy ideology, which has prompted her to exact her revenge on that particular part of his body. So I think it's like a poetic justice. It was very kind of funny. And then she kind of, after she's done the deed, she says that it was a perfect cut. So that was a nice bit of script there from Sam Ashurst. I appreciated that. So those were my main thoughts about the movie, that it's really kind of operating around opposing discourses. The discourse of the predator, who's initially coming from a place of inferiority, so he feels he has to reduce the value of his perceived rival's status by over-endowing her with meaning and kind of fetishizing her. He perceives her as a castrating agency. He feels like she'll take something away from him. And that in psychoanalysis is the fundamental definition of a castration complex. When someone feels that they hold something dear and they worry that someone's going to take it away from them. So it doesn't just have to do with like the physical cutting of a penis. It has to do with a desired object and the fear that it's going to be taken away. Yeah, ultimately his fear comes true. That's the kind of tragedy of this tale, is that the tables do turn. He gets it exactly in the place where he most deserves it. So it's like comical, but it also provides like a moment of satisfaction for the viewer, because we unconsciously know that's where he perceived his power to reside. And so the fact that it's like disfigured feels proportional. It feels just. There's been some form of justice served. So for that reason, it's a very fun film. It's very creative, like the way that it all comes together. And yeah, I'm going to be checking out Sam's earlier film, hopefully soon. And in the meantime, I hope you get a chance to see A Little More Flesh. Take care. Bye.